Well, good morning to everyone. I want to begin by, on behalf of Beverly, thanking all of you for your thoughts and your prayers and your visits and your cards and food. It's just been overwhelming. This is such a great class, such a wonderful community of faith. We're just honored and privileged to be part of it. So thank you both so much. Thank you all so much. We are back in the Gospel of Mark. We are at Mark chapter 5 and verse 21. This passage has been called a story within a story, a miracle on the way to a miracle. There's two powerful stories condensed in this short passage. It seems like forever since I taught. So just a quick reminder about the Gospel of Mark. It's, of course, the first gospel written. It was written around 30 years after the death of Christ. It was written by a disciple of Peter named John Mark. These are the words of Peter, possibly even Peter's sermons. And Mark is a very distinct gospel in that it moves very quickly. It's filled with action-packed stories, and they're very short and succinct. And it's just like almost every word needs to be studied. And I'll try not to do that, but let's pick it up now. Verse 21. Remember now, prior to this, Jesus has been on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. He's been on the Jordanian side. He has gone to a big cemetery, an area of catacombs, and there is a demon-possessed man who calls himself a legion. Jesus delivers him from the multitude of demons, casts those demons into pigs. Those pigs rush down into the Sea of Galilee and they drown. Now, verse 21, Jesus got into the boat again. Remember when I first started this and I asked you the question, why did Jesus choose so many fishermen to be disciples? And you have some great answers. But I was thinking about that, and one of the reasons I believe is because he moved or traveled so much by boat. You would want fishermen. You wouldn't want Matthew, the tax collector, in charge of the boat. And so Jesus gets in the boat, and he goes back to the other side of the lake. The other side would be the western side or the Israeli side. He's moving back toward the area of Capernaum. We don't know exactly where he's going to be at. But when he lands, it says a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. So imagine that this passage is like a movie. And so it helps if you can picture these scenes. Here comes Jesus in that little boat. He's got his 12 disciples with him. And they land on the shore, and here once again is a huge crowd of people. And now this crowd is going to follow him. Verse 22 and verse 23 says, then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live. So Jesus is leaving the Sea of Galilee, and he's going to whatever this little village is. This big crowd is all around him. They all want to be close to this famous person. They're bumping into one another. It's just like a mob that's moving along. And then all of a sudden, here comes the leader of the local synagogue. Now, this was in Israeli terms, it was almost like being mayor of the city. It was a person that was picked from among the members of the synagogue. It was a powerful and important position. You were not chosen unless you were a person of resources, because not only were you giving your time, you'd have to give of your money for many reasons to keep that synagogue running. You also had the responsibility to choose a speaker, either a rabbi, a local rabbi, or maybe one that was visiting, or another person who was considered a teacher. It was a very powerful and prestigious position. And yet this person, and we know his name was Jairus, He comes to Jesus and he falls at his feet. Can you picture this? Here comes the mayor of the city. He runs the synagogue. He is the representative of Jewish religion. And now he's coming to this maverick, itinerant preacher who's been kicked out of other synagogues. This Jesus has a bad name among most of the Jewish people. And yet, this powerful and prestigious person humbles himself before this outcast, and he falls at his feet, pleading fervently with him. Can you see this scene in the movie? Wouldn't this make a great scene? And all this crowd is around thinking, oh my gosh, is that who I think? Oh, that's Jairus. That's the leader of the synagogue. Can you believe it? He's fallen to his knees in front of Jesus. And what does Jairus says? My little daughter is dying. What an emotional moment. Here's daddy saying, Jesus, I've got a little girl, my little daughter. And we know from the Gospel of Luke, from that account, that this is Jairus's only child, only daughter. And we'll read later in this passage that she's 12 years old. And in Jewish culture in that day and time, a woman could be betrothed or even married at age 12. So here is a young girl right on the edge, on the threshold of womanhood. She can soon be married, start her own life. And so it's like this is a double tragedy. And Jairus says, please come and lay your hands on her so she can live. Verse 24, here's Jesus' reaction. Jesus went with him and all the people followed. Can you see that? Oh, they're excited. They've heard about Jesus, this miracle maker, this one who casts out demons and heals lepers. And so this crowd, just almost like following a fire truck or an ambulance through town. They're all following Jesus, this big crowd. And the end of verse 24 is very important. It says they are crowding around him. In the Greek, it says they are pressing in on him. Picture this group of people. They're just shoulder to shoulder, bumping one another, and they're weaving through the houses in this little village, trying to get to Jairus's place. Everybody wants to be close. They want to hear what's said. They want to be able to see this miracle if it's going to take place. And so as this mass of people are moving to Jairus's house, where his little girl lies dying, suddenly the story within the story begins to unfold and take place. Verse 25 says, a woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. Now, this is probably vaginal bleeding. And if so, it means this woman is defiled and unclean in the eyes of the Jewish people. It means that the bed she sleeps in is unclean and defiled. Any chair she sits on is unclean and defiled. Any person she touches, even if it's a family member, they are unclean and defiled, and they need to go to a priest and go through a ritual to be cleaned. So my point is, this poor woman for 12 years has been as much a social and religious outcast as any leper, as any tax collector, as the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well. And she's had this problem for 12 years. Now, interesting, I came across this. It says this issue of bleeding apparently was a common problem. Let me read from a commentary. The Talmud, which is a compilation of Jewish teachings that were considered sacred, listed 11 cures, and they were just crazy cures. It just shows you how primitive medicine was in that day. There were several tonic concoctions of oil, water, wine, ashes, and crushed bones. Or then there was one where you carried an ostrich egg. I can't imagine that there were a lot of ostrich eggs in that area. Carried an ostrich egg in a linen rag, And you had to either carry it in your left pocket or right pocket, depending on the season of the year. And my favorite one was you had to find barley seed from the dung of a female donkey. And then you had to carry that seed with you until you. And so medicine in those days was so primitive. And there were so many superstitions. It made me think about Uganda and our Tree of Life ministry. It made me think about Vicki Smith and a story or two or three that she had shared with me. So I asked her to share this morning, and you might have heard her talking earlier. She has strep throat and unable to speak clearly. So she sent me a couple of texts. And so let me read those to you. I believe that God put me in the presence of those that needed my skills. When the health care system failed to identify the issue, I knew exactly what the problem was because of my background or personal experience. Jesus isn't physically here for the sick to touch his robe, but we are. If we say yes when he calls us, and I love this, he will place those he's called and those in need together. And then she gives an example about primitive medicine and how God was able to work through her. A little boy about 10 years old was brought to me. For several years, he had suffered from sores over 50% of his body. The villagers were afraid of him. I liken it to how the people were with leprosy. He was unable to attend school. His mother had taken him to the clinic for years with no diagnosis. One day, Pastor Charles brought him to the village of Kakambo, where I was working in the clinic. The moment I examined him, I knew exactly what the little boy suffered from because I too have the same chronic disease. Because James' problem had never been treated, he had a severe secondary infection. I treated the infection and also treated him with my own medication that I had with me. His sores healed after several days while I kept him in the clinic. It's a wonderful example about how parts of our world are still as primitive in their medicine as in the days of Jesus. And yet we can be the hands and feet of Jesus today that bring healing. And I'm going to talk about that more as we get to the end of this passage. And then verse 26 said she had suffered a great deal from many doctors. Now that's not real complimentary of the medical industry. She had suffered from many doctors. And over the years, she had spent everything she had to pay them. When I was reading this, it reminded me of the 5 or 6 times over my years of ministry when I had gone with church members to faith healers when they were sick with a terminal illness. It seemed that the medical world could do nothing for them. And they had been told by a friend about such and such faith healer. If you will go to them, maybe you will be healed. And again, they were desperate. They were ready to try anything. And again, this passage says she had spent everything she had to pay them. Now, not only was medicine in that day and time very primitive, but a lot of them were just considered snake oil salesmen, just real, they didn't have the best reputation. And in some of these faith healing events, I hate to call them a worship service because I did not leave with a good impression at all. But among the many negative impressions I came away with was that instead of passing a plate, they would pass 5-gallon buckets. And the reason for that was because they were wanting more than cash. I've seen people take off their wedding ring and put it in there, take off their good watch, put it in there. One time I was sitting next to a guy who pulled out a piece of paper. And I glanced at it. I realized immediately that was the title to a car. And they were under the impression that in order to be healed, they had to take a big step of faith. And the greatest step of faith was giving money or a material item. And also in these 5-gallon buckets. Now I'm dating myself, but remember back in the day when credit cards first came out, you took the credit card and you put it in this device and you went with it. I don't remember what those were called, but there was one of those in every 5-gallon bucket. And so people were maxing out credit cards. They were giving all the money they had in this world. And having been to so many of those events, and some of those, a couple of times I went with an individual who was in a wheelchair. And because of that, he could get a first row seat. And I never saw a person healed. A lot of emotion. I just saw people come who were suffering and they left suffering. So I can relate to this verse in too many ways. And it ends by saying, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Cannot tell you how painful it was as a pastor to go to big events, Houston, Dallas, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and to go with a member who was suffering. And when they left, with all the faith they could muster and all that they could give financially, they left suffering. So that's what this woman has been going through for 12 years. Now we're going to come to verses 27 and 28. This is where that story within a story really picks up the pace. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask Bill to comment on him. She had heard about Jesus, so he came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. Not him, but touches his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Bill?
You're muted.
All right, Ricky. Well, Ricky has set this story up beautifully, and that you can just picture, if you would, that crowd following Jesus from the synagogue. And all of a sudden, with the crowd still around him, you notice that this woman who's in the crowd wants to come to Jesus, but she kind of sneaks up on him and tries to just touch his garment, so that she figures that if she can just touch it and he won't even notice, she'll sneak off into the crowd and be healed. No doubt she'd seen some of the other miracles that he had done, and she was pretty impressed. He was a great miracle healer. She probably thought, like a lot of these people, Ricky, that came to those meetings, she saw something and she wanted it, and she was going to try and get a little of it. And I think that seeking out that power by touching his garment was her big motive. This story, I can go on and on, but I'm just going to point out a couple of things that impressed me. I'm sure some of you in the class, there's some things about this story that impress you also. But let me mention a couple of things that I noticed that we can really be encouraged by this story. Not only about the healing, but just the story about Jesus helping her. But there's also some things that we can learn from this story that tell us about some of the discouraging things. First of all, I noticed that this woman had a very feeble faith. She had a very weak, I'd say almost an impractical faith. You know, whenever you look at her, I think you see a woman who had no idea about what she was trying to do except get some help. She believed Jesus was a healer. She believed she could get help. And so she just snuck up there and saw she'd try and get something and get out of there. I think a lot of us come to Jesus and we worry about having too little of a faith. We come to Jesus and we think, you even hear some preachers say, or teachers say, well, you don't have enough faith. Or you don't have a right kind of faith. Well, the encouraging thing about this story is this woman not only didn't have much faith, she didn't have a very wholesome kind of faith. She was a woman who brought to Jesus a very, very poor, primitive kind of faith. And yet, Jesus turned to and healed her. Obviously, this story emphasizes the fact there is a mystery about healing. Those of us who've been through diseases like this woman, blood diseases, cancers, infections, things that doctors can't figure out exactly what to do. Sometimes they can't figure out even what you got, but when they figure it out, they don't know exactly what to do, or they try 3 or 4 things and it takes years. Sometimes it doesn't work at all. And people pray and pray and pray and nothing happens. Well, here's a woman who did that for 12 years. And yet she finally came to Jesus. So there is a mystery about who gets healed and who doesn't get healed. But there's not a mystery about one thing in this story. Even though this woman had a very weak, a very unclear, a very tiny faith, Jesus accepted her. And for some reason, he looked into her heart and Jesus healed her. You know, the encouraging to me is, if you're worried about how good your faith is, don't worry. If you have even the faith the size of a mustard seed, Jesus will listen to you. Jesus will accept you. But we don't know whether he's going to heal or not. But we know at least he will listen. We know at least that your faith has the possibility of being healed. I notice that sometimes belief is merely an act of the mind, though. Sometimes we believe, but that's not faith. She believed, but faith was she got up and she went to Jesus and she humbled herself and she reached out to him. So she had real faith. Maybe it wasn't the strongest faith, but she had real faith. Sometimes all we want to do is sit and tell him what we want. We can believe that Jesus do things, but do we reach out? Do we actually get up and go to him? I think sometimes also I'm encouraged by this is, see, this woman's faith was very feeble in that she didn't have very much intellectual understanding. Her faith was intellectually in error, in that she didn't know who she was talking to. She knew he was a healer, but she didn't know much beyond that. Isn't it good to know that if you have a distorted faith, or you see somebody else whose faith is different than yours, you wonder, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm praying wrong. Maybe I'm not saying the right thing. I don't know. Here's the good news. Even if our intellectual faith is not correct, Jesus sees our heart. He knows us. He knows what's going on, and he'll accept us. I think it's tremendously encouraging, because sometimes I wonder, I say, Bill, you know, do you have the kind of faith that Jesus wants? I see other people and they're different. Jesus accepts us even though we may be like this woman. The second thing I want you to notice, though, that I see in this story is that here's this woman. She has a very distorted view of who Jesus is. It's quite obvious, isn't it? She thought Jesus was just a healer. And, you know, I'm sure there are stories of other healers, just like Ricky was telling us. You know, you hear about somebody coming, bringing their tent or going to an arena, and you say, oh, so-and-so, the famous healer's coming. I'm going to get some of that. She probably had sort of a feeble kind of understanding and belief about who Jesus was. She didn't know that he was truly God's son. Let me just say this. It's quite encouraging to me that I can come to Jesus. And even when I was younger, and especially when I was trying to know more about God and know who Jesus was, even if we can't understand who Jesus is completely, how he can be God and be man, how Jesus could have all the difficulties that we know about, and yet Jesus was able to accept her. That even though we come to him and we do not have a clear view of who he is, somehow he turned to this woman and he'll turn to us. Don't worry about it. Even though you may think, boy, my knowledge of God is really bad. I wish I knew more. If I knew more, I would be more acceptable. No, the thing that's going to accept you, if you look at this woman, this story tells me the thing that's going to accept Jesus is that your heart be pure and humble, that your motives be pure and humble. I think there's a big difference between magic and miracles. This woman received a miracle because she wasn't just believing in magic. You know what magic is, as Vicky was pointing out, magic is kind of where when you're sick, you go try and get help from somebody as a healer. You try and do whatever the thing you got to carry around or whatever you got to do to make the magic happen. In the primitive cultures I visited around the world, and the ones that I read about, just like you do, magic is where people feel like there is power inside of an object. And if we can just touch that object, some of the power will pull out to us. It may be a stone, it may be a statue, it may be some kind of a liquid. But if we can just get in touch with the object, the form that they've got, this energy, this force will pour out of it into us. That's magic. A miracle is not that. A miracle is when a personal relationship happens and you know that the God is giving you this energy, this, as he says, Jesus, something's come out of me, not some object. One of the problems the church has had, it's encouraging me to remember this. One of the problems the church has had over the years has given us a bad rap. The reason many people can't stand Christianity is that Christianity started in those early first years with Jesus and with John, was that they basically had a very simple faith, where their forms of coming to Jesus, the forms that they had around them were just symbols to help them remember who Jesus was. In other words, like whenever Jesus had the Last Supper, he got them together. And when Jesus told them, now when I'm gone, and it's going to be now pretty soon, when I'm gone, you remember when you drink a glass of wine, when you get together and you take this bread, remember my body that was given for you. Remember my blood that was shed for you. Well, all of a sudden we said, oh, that's a great thing. So then for years afterwards, people took the bread and took the wine. And it reminded them of what Jesus had done for them. And they were so grateful. But then some went so far as to say, wait a minute. Maybe Jesus was saying, if we drink wine and water, drink wine and eat bread, we're actually getting Jesus's grace. And all of a sudden the form, which changes all the time, the form turned into the norm, where people got to say, oh, I know how I get the grace. I can just touch the object. I can just drink a little wine. I can just eat a little bread and I'll have God's grace. No, you won't have God's grace. You'll be just like these people, these primitives who are looking for the power, but not looking for the person. This story reminds me of the importance of us not letting the form become the norm, not letting those things that we do in a church, like the Lord's Supper, like baptism, like church membership, where we get to thinking that those things will give us grace. No, they point us to grace. Grace comes only one way, from Jesus himself, like he did with her. And then I think the third thing I noticed about her is that she had a selfish motive for reaching out to Jesus. Even though she had a selfish motive, somehow Jesus looked into her heart and he realized this woman, yes, she wants to take care of herself only, but there's something there that Jesus saw. I can't explain it. Maybe you have an idea what it was, but I can't explain it. I know this. Let me ask you, when you pray, when you ask Jesus for something, what's your ultimate motive? If your motive is, Jesus, I want to be healed because I want to feel good and I want to have pleasure. I have to admit this morning, Ricky, sometimes when I pray, it's selfish. I just want to be healed. I just want to feel good. I'm sick and tired of being sick. Sometimes I wonder, does Jesus like the way I'm praying? Is my motives just for me? Because, the Bible says it over and over again, that somehow our motive ought to be bigger than ourselves. I remember I got this verse that I read this morning, and during Phyllis and I, during our devotional, it's from James. It says, when you ask for something, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. Bill, do you ask to get well so that you can serve others? Do you ask to be healthy so you can be a servant? The question is, why did she come to him? She came, it looks like, with a selfish motive. Maybe Jesus saw that she would probably turn into somebody that could be a servant, that her heart would change, that she was thinking more than just herself. I know this. There's also very much a danger that we sometimes don't get what we need, what we want, because we're not asking with the right motive. So anyway, those are three things, Ricky, I saw about this woman that may cause us to be encouraged that he accepts us even when we're pretty weak. But also it's discouraging, and that sometimes we get trapped into just looking for the power and not for the person.
Well, thank you, Bill. That is always very insightful and very encouraging. So the woman slips up behind Jesus, touches his robe, and verse 29 says, immediately. By the way, the word immediately, or in your translation may say it once. That's Mark's favorite word or favorite phrase in the Gospel of Mark. It's there over 40 times. And so what Mark is saying, I need to finish the verse. Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition immediately. This wasn't a gradual process like taking medicine or doing rehab. This was instantaneous. This is a miracle. And so here's one of those places in the Bible where it makes a very clear statement about Jesus. And so as we read this, we have to say, you can't take this figuratively, or either someone made this up or it literally happened. What am I going to believe about this Jesus? So again, immediately, and she could feel in her body. Don't you wonder what that was like? She could feel what that was, at the power of God. How do you describe the healing power of God? Some translations say it was virtue, the virtue of Jesus. In verse 30, now here's where we're going to see an exchange takes place. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him. You see, just as the woman realizes her body is different, Jesus realizes his body is different. What was that like? How do you explain that? How do you put that into words? And I have a question for us this morning. As that power or that virtue or whatever we're going to call it goes out of Jesus in such a way that he can feel it in his body, what, if any, effect did that have on him? Tell me what you think. Was that just kind of like him exhaling air? It must have been something powerful for him to feel it in his body. To me, it seemed like it must have been more than goosebumps. Yeah. What do you think? And how would that have affected him in one way or another?
Well, Rick, it's Ralph. My first thought was that if you consider that Jesus is fully human, I almost think that it's kind of like an athlete when he's given everything, he's won or he's finished the race, and it's just like he's exhausted, or you can tell in his body's just different, because he used what he had, and now he's completed that. So I take it that there's some sort of not exhaustion, is probably a bad word for him, but something that just felt like he was less than 100% at that time, and I don't know how better to describe my thinking, my words, than saying he just like something, he was exhausted, and something all of a sudden they had, they didn't have it anymore because he's human. I don't know. That's my first thought.
That's a great thought, Ralph. I wonder about that also. And I wonder if that's why Jesus often had to go apart and be separate from people. Was it like that he had to be, for lack of a better word or image, recharged? Was it that he needed that virtue, that closeness with God, that infilling? Today we'd call it the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Anyway, I don't have any great theological answer for it, but there must have been a powerful exchange of some type of supernatural energy that went from him into her. And so once he realized that healing power had gone out from him, he turns around and he asks, "Who touched me?" Because he wants to know that power's gone out from me. Who's it gone into? Who is this person that's been healed and be touched? And verse 31, here's where the disciples make a typical disciple response. And remember, now we are the disciples. We like to think, oh, I would have never acted like that or believed like that. I would have had more faith. Oh, we just have to be honest. We're just like the disciples. And the disciples look at him and said, "What are you talking about? Look at this crowd. They're bumping into us. We're bumping into you. Everybody's touching everybody. How can you?" In other words, they don't have a clue about the exchange. That they have not felt any of this spiritual power. Verse 32, but he kept on looking around to see who had done it. That word looking in the Greek means to gaze with an intense focus. You ever been pulled over by a DPS officer for speeding? Nobody I know probably has ever done this but me. You get a ticket and you're going about 15 miles over the speed limit, and the officer comes up, you lower your window, and he stares bullets through you with those eyes that have been trained, looking for whatever else you might be thinking or doing, that intense focus. This is the same word that's used in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus heals the man with a withered hand, and the response by the people in the synagogue is, that's not right. You healed on the Sabbath. And Jesus looked at them with this intense focus, and as if he was grieved in his heart. So my thought here is that I wonder what it would have been like for Jesus to stare at you like that, with that intense focus. I don't know about you, but I would have quickly examined my heart. I think it just must have been very, very powerful.
Ricky, I want to say something.
Sure.
Just one thing just really stirs me is that I was so encouraged by this. When I think that there's nearly over 7 billion people on the planet, and sometimes Phyllis and I know in our prayers and in my private prayers, I say, "Father, I don't get it. I don't see how you can care about little old me, how you can even know this little dot on the planet exists, much less care about me individually, personally, when you got so many children." I imagine some of you think that same kind of thing. Well, this story, what a beautiful story to remind us that God's way, his radar, his intelligence is so absolutely amazing. He reads the minds of people. He can look at 2, 3, 4, or 7 billion people at one time. Now, we're having a hard time understanding that, but it's becoming a little bit easier with artificial intelligence. Even machines can communicate with billions of people at one time. Well, think about what the Creator can do. So I am really encouraged by the fact that whatever divinity, holiness, uniqueness that Jesus had, he could see every individual and notice what they're thinking. And that touching business, that somehow his holiness, his uniqueness went out to her. I see that as tremendously encouraging.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, Phyllis,
I don't really think Jesus asked the question, "Who touched me?" because he didn't know. I think maybe he asked the question to illustrate something. And when he healed this woman, you got to think, yes, he healed her, but look at what he restored. Ricky, you did a beautiful job at the beginning talking about how isolated she was from society. And now she's clean, she's whole, she can return to her family, to her faith community. When God does something, when Jesus does something, he really does it. And he didn't do this. Yes, he did it for her. But look at all of the other things, the ripple effect that happens when Jesus does something. So I don't think he was wondering who it was. I think he knew who it was. And I think maybe he was interested to see what her reaction would be. Just my thought.
That's a great thought, Phyllis. And on some of that, you must have been reading my notes here, because I wanted to get down to verse 34. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. So he not only heals her physically, but he restores her to her place in the family and in society and in religion. And so it made me think, we can't heal today like Jesus did, but we can heal by being his hands and feet. We can help people, give guidance and with resources. But I'm wondering if, as we look at what Jesus did, how he restored people in all areas, if that couldn't be a criteria for starting and evaluating ministry. Will this ministry heal? And will it heal in many different ways to help restore people? So I'll just cast out that thought. Y'all can mull over that. Verse 35, while he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived for the home of Jairus. Oh my gosh, Jairus, we forgot about him. We left him behind in the crowd. Remember the guy who fell on his knees before Jesus at the seashore? His daughter is sick, and he's trying to hurry and get Jesus there. And now there's been this interruption. Jairus has awaited patiently, and here is the response. Messengers arrived from the home of Jairus. They told him, your daughter is dead. Now, she probably died while Jesus was healing this woman. And Jairus, can you imagine the emotions that are rumbling around in him? Jesus, if you had just been there. Remember the story about Lazarus? And Mary and Martha thought, Jesus, if you'd just been here, if you'd just shown up on time, things would have been different. We've all thought that, haven't we? Verse 36, but Jesus overheard, some translations say ignored them, and said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just have faith. In other words, fear must have just washed over Jairus. My daughter's dead. She's gone forever. Jesus said, no, wait. Don't think that way. Don't have that reaction. Hold on to your faith. Hold on to your faith. Don't let go of that. You know, we all go through situations where we're tempted to we want to give up. We've tried, we've prayed, we've done everything, but we just can't let go. We have to remember, don't let go. Hold on to our faith. Verse 37, then Jesus stopped the crowd. That must have been hard because they just seen a miracle. Jesus is going, they think, to raise this girl from the dead, but Jesus stops the crowd and won't let anyone go with him. Even 9 of his disciples are restricted. He's only going to take Peter, James, and John. So let me real quickly ask, why? Why do you think Jesus took only Peter, James, and John?
Ricky, it's Dora. The
Okay.
practical reason is there was no more room in the house.
That's possible. Houses were very, very small. You know, the average house back then was like 200 square feet with maybe 2 rooms. So that's a possibility. Other thoughts?
Ricky, I think this is Roger. I think maybe the answer is OJT. he knew that his disciples, those disciples, needed this on-job training, and he wanted them to witness.
Okay, that's excellent, because we know Peter, James, and John are going to become leaders of the church, the major leaders of the church. Any other thought?
That's all right. It's Amy.
I think maybe he left the other 9 to continue the work. There were still people there who were following Jesus, who wanted to hear a word or who wanted to experience what they were experiencing. So he left them to continue the work with the crowd.
There you go. That's another great thought. Amy, you had one?
I thought maybe it was the speed that you can move with less people. If you have a huge crowd and you're trying to, herd them all over to a certain place, it takes a lot longer than if you've got just a couple of people and we're just gonna get there now. Let's stop the slow move and get onto a more fast track.
That's great. Those are excellent thoughts. Really, all very good thoughts. Verse 38, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. Now, let me read to you a quote from a commentary to help you understand the Jewish mentality and tradition and custom when death occurred, how they thought differently than we as Christians think today. Jewish mourning customs were vivid and detailed, and practically all of them were designed to stress the desolation and the final separation of death. The triumphant, victorious hope of the Christian faith was totally absent. Immediately after death had taken place, a loud wailing began so that all might know that death had struck. And the wailing would be repeated at the graveside, which would be that same day. The mourners hung over the dead body, begging for a response from the silent lips. They pulled out their hair and rent their garments. And the rending of garments was done according to tradition. And it was done just before the body was buried and hidden from sight. Garments were rent downward from the neck to the heart. For fathers and mothers, the rent was on the left side over the heart. For others, it was on the right side. And the rent garment was worn for 30 days. After 7 days, the rent might be roughly sewn up, but only in a way that it was still clearly visible. After 30 days, the garment was then properly repaired. Also, the playing of a flute was inseparably connected with death and burial. Tradition was that, however poor a husband was, he might have at least 2 flute players at his wife's funeral. And even the poorest man must cease from work for 3 days. This prohibition extended even to his servants. He could not even read the law or the prophets, as this was meant to bring joy to a man. However, he was allowed to read Job, Jeremiah, and Lamentations. And he must eat only in his own house, and he must abstain from meat and wine. He must not leave the town or village for 30 days. And it was the custom to eat sitting on the floor, using a chair as a table. Also, all family members of the deceased were to eat eggs dipped in ashes and salt. If the deceased person had never been married, a form of marriage service was part of the burial. So you can see, with no hope of resurrection, how fearful it must have been to experience death. So no wonder Jesus told Jairus, don't be afraid. Verse 39, he went inside and asked, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep. Can you imagine what they were thinking? I've been at the bedside of friend or members when they passed, when there was family there, when there were hospice workers. There's been times when I received a call that so-and-so had passed, can you please come? And I walk into this room, and again, there's family and friends, there's crying, there's hospice workers who are standing by quietly and respectfully. Imagine that I did that and say, hey, folks, what's going on here? Nothing to be upset about. This person's not dead, they're just asleep. Might have been my last day on the job, huh? What do you think? And verse 40, here's their reaction. The crowd laughed at him. They didn't put their hands over their mouth. They didn't roll their eyes. They didn't stare at one another. They laughed to mock him. And verse 41, with all these people mocking him, and with mom and dad there hoping, hanging on to faith, and Peter, James, and John thinking, boy, we've seen him have power over the storm and over lepers and withered hands. Oh my gosh, has he got it over death? Holding her hand. Now, remember now, Jewish law said you don't touch a dead person. That's considered a corpse. That makes you undefiled and unclean. But Jesus, remember, he's touched the leper. Time after time, he's telling the Jewish people, and I think he's still telling us today, you don't correctly understand God. If you want to understand God, just look at me. I'm bringing you the full manifestation, understanding, realization of God. And so he holds her hand. This is such a tender moment. He holds her hand. He says to her, Talitha cum. Now, those two words are important because they're not Hebrew. They're not Greek. Those are Arabic. That means Jesus spoke multiple languages. And it's also important because it meant that Peter, who was one of the three disciples, distinctly remembers this moment. He remembers when Jesus not only healed, but he spoke in Arabic. And remember, these are the words of Peter to John Mark. It's a great validation that it was indeed Peter who told these stories to Mark. Verse 42, and the girl who was 12 years old, immediately, there's Mark's favorite word again. This wasn't a gradual process where she kind of woke up. Immediately, she stands up and walks around. And they were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Don't you know that they were? In verse 43, as we wrap this up, Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. And he probably gave her something to eat for two reasons. Number one, to prove this is not a ghost. This is not a phantom. This is not an apparition. This is that girl. And he also said that because, you know, teenagers are always hungry, right? All right. Thank you for your time. And so I will send out information about next week's passage. I'll send that out in a few days. Ralph?